There's also like another a bomb essentially, and it is winding its way through the Senate. This reconciliation bill,
Yeah.
And you have a piece out just I think yesterday about what it's just going to do to not just to Medicaid. And Deborah, I don't even know if you touch on Medicare in there because of the sequestration that could potentially follow from it.
There are actually a couple things with Medicare, but yeah.
The entire sort of like medical system that's going to be like, I don't know if there's ever been a single bill that I remember, at least in the 20 years that I've been doing this, that has such dramatic implications for daily life for so many millions of Americans in a negative way.
It's going to affect every American at some level. And as you've talked about, the fact that we're in this news vortex going on right now, where we have immigration stuff and protests and this Iran situation with Israel, it's not getting a lot of attention.
No.
And it's hard to get traction on it. We're doing a daily or almost daily newsletter called Trump's Beautiful Disaster, because the bill's called the Big Beautiful Bill. So we went back to the 90s with 311 reference, Beautiful Disaster, a song by a band there. But anyway, we're covering it because of this impact, but it's been hard to break through. And I don't think people realize the extent to which this will have such a massive amount of disruption, particularly in the health system. So right now, the situation is that a number of rural hospitals in particular are struggling to survive. There is a report that says 1/3 of all rural hospitals, and that's about 700 hospitals across the country, are at risk of closure right now. And if you take $1 trillion out of the healthcare system, which is kind of what this will do, mainly by cutting Medicaid, that's the primary thing, and moving 11 million people off the Medicaid rolls, you're going to get a situation where suddenly the budgets of these rural hospitals will just go into the toilet. I mean, Medicaid is often the biggest line item in these budgets. You're talking about a program that has 73 million people
for revenue
right now. For revenue. And, some hospitals complain about low reimbursement rates in Medicaid, but there are programs that boost that are also being attacked in this bill. There's this program where the federal government will kick in extra money so that doctors will accept Medicaid and hospitals will accept Medicaid. And that was cut in the Senate bill.
That is the provider tax, right?
It's not quite the provider tax. It's a different thing called state-directed payments. But those have been attacked in the Senate bill.
Don't those provider taxes pay for those state-directed payments?
No, the state-directed payments come from the federal government. The provider tax is a separate thing that is a way for states to get more resources in Medicaid. And what happens is the state taxes a hospital. Let's say the state taxes a hospital $100. But what they say is also, we'll reimburse you more through our Medicaid program by $100. So the hospital is held harmless. They're paying a tax, but they're getting the money back. But when you increase those rates and the state pays $100, Medicaid is a federal state program. So the federal government is kicking in some of that money. So by doing this circulation, it's a way to get the federal government to pay a little bit more.
Right. Okay.
And the state direct payments are supplements on top of that. So there's two things going on here, right? And both of those are being cut by the Senate bill in particular. There are other cuts in the House bill.
Ends up being more egregious than
worse.
The House bill, which is sort of shocking.
It's crazy. It's crazy. And so what does this mean? There are hundreds of rural hospitals that are likely to have to close because of what happens in this bill. And what does it mean when a hospital closes? There are sick people in the hospital that have to be moved. And if you're talking about a rural hospital, it's probably have to be moved an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours away. And that could be life-threatening in and of itself. The second part if you have a rural town, and they lose their hospital, it's an anchor for the community. These are often the biggest employers in that community. You could obliterate an entire town by losing their rural hospital. And then 3, for patients, now the nearest hospital to where I live is 3 hours away. If you have a heart attack, if you have an emergency situation, you might not be able to get to the hospital in time. If you have a loved one that has to stay in a hospital somewhere else, you might have to pay to go to a hotel so you can see your loved one and help them through a time when they're sick. There are real burdens for patients. And then think about the burden on the remaining hospitals. So all of a sudden, they're getting patients from a larger area.
But wait a second.
Yeah.
If you cut Medicaid, doesn't that mean that those 11 million people they get healthy and never have to go to the hospital, right? Isn't that the theory?
Actually, what happens is those 11 million people no longer have coverage, but if they're sick, they're still going to go to the hospital. And we have a law in this country that says if you are in an emergency and you go to the emergency room, that
you have to get
treated. And that is called uncompensated care. So if that person can't afford it because, they
don't
poor
have
enough to be on
insurance?
Medicaid and they don't have health insurance, they're going to basically go and get treatment without getting paid. And that's a burden on the hospitals.
And then it ends up being a cost that is picked up by private insurance and by essentially the public dole.
More by the hospitals, right? Because the hospitals are the one giving the treatment and not getting paid for it.
But they pass that
well, they asked for higher payments, but they might not be able to wrangle higher payments out of the insurance companies. And the other part of this is that more people are going to be coming in, whether they're insured or uninsured. They're going to be coming into that hospital. Hospitals are already understaffed. They already need more physicians. They already need more nurses. If you had a week wait time to see a doctor before, maybe it's 2 weeks now. And the healthcare system is very interdependent. If you have something go down in one side of it, the other side's going to be affected.
COVID. I mean, we saw how supplies had to be moved within the hospital system. If you have shut down a bunch of public hospitals, like Andrew Cuomo happened to have in the run up before COVID, there are hospitals that get overrun in terms of the burden and in cost and whatnot. And so this is going to have, and we should say that as little attention as it has gotten relative to the implications of this, look at the polling on this. Let's play this clip from Harry Enton on, is that his name, Harry Enton?
Yeah.
On CNN. He's never seen polling on legislation look worse, but it's
a soft intensity though, right? Because people don't really know about it.
People don't know about it. Is clip number, we have this. Yeah. Yep. And of course, there's other elements of this bill, and but this is like sort of where the biggest chunk of money in terms of cuts are coming from.
That's right.
Where is support for this mega bill?
I'm really surprised when I look at polling data. I look at it every day. But the amount of disapproval for this bill, holy cow, my goodness gracious. And you mentioned the KFF poll. We're talking about 29 points underwater on the net favorable rating. But that matches the Quinnipiac University poll from last week when it was 26 points underwater. Oh, my God, you need Greg Louganis to get that far underwater. And, I mean, we're talking about a negative 41 net favorability rating among independents in the center of the electorate. You rarely ever see pieces of legislation or proposed pieces of legislation as unpopular as this. But here you see it in two polls, 26 points underwater and 29 points underwater. No good.
Extra, read all about it, mister.
I know.
It's 26 points underwater.
I mean,
did this guy fight in World War II?
I don't know. He's one of the doughboys. But, I mean, this is pretty stunning, but also does not seem to have, I mean, what are the prospects? Well, let's first talk about the bird bath stuff, because there's a lot of stuff in this bill that came from the House that goes into Senate. It's a reconciliation process, which means they only need 50 plus 1 to pass it. It is not subject to a filibuster. However, there's a set of rules named after Robert Byrd, a now long deceased former Democratic and former Dixiecratic
senator from West Virginia.
And tell people about those Byrd rules and the process in which it goes through what they call the Byrd bath.
So this is a budget reconciliation bill, right? So in order to qualify for that special status where it can be passed by 50 votes, everything has to have a primary budgetary purpose. And it's not just that it has to have a budgetary purpose, because if you cut $10 here, then that has a budgetary purpose. That has to be the primary reason why it's in the bill. It cannot be a policy that is sort of masquerading as a budget item. And because, once this rule was established, senators got more clever about trying to reach their policy goals through budgetary means. Right. And so the Senate's sort of arbiter, the parliamentarian, the famed parliamentarian, is the one who decides, nope, that actually you're trying to do policy there, and that doesn't qualify under the 50 vote standard. So we're going to kick that part out of the bill.
And the parties, the two different parties, basically go to the parliamentarian, file almost like what would be functionally like briefs.
They should put these on television. The Democrats, in this case, the Democrats, say, I raise a point of order about this part of the bill. And I say that this actually has a policy purpose and not a budgetary purpose. And then there's a debate between the Democratic staff and the Republican staff with the parliamentarian present, and then the parliamentarian eventually makes a ruling. And that ruling is that this either gets to stay in the bill or this has to go. And we actually got last night some early answers on some of this stuff. With three of the, every committee in the Senate has a different part of the bill. 3 committees that have lesser parts of the bill. They got rulings. And the biggest thing is yet another kind of survival from a near-death experience for the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. So in the bill, the way that the CFPB is structured is that they get their money from the Federal Reserve. They don't get their money from the budget. So the question is, well, how do we ding the CFPB if it's not budgetary? They're not on the budget. So what they did was they said, okay, we're going to put a cap on how much money the Fed can give the CFPB. And that cap will be the 0% of the Fed's available resources. In other words, we're going to zero out the budget of the CFPB. Well, the Democrats challenged this and said, you're just trying to kill the CFPB. You're not trying to save money for the budget, because it doesn't save money for the budget, not directly. And the parliamentarian agreed with the Democrats, and they kicked that part out of the bill. So the CFPB will still get its current complement. There is actually a cap on CFPB resources, and it's like 8% of what the Fed has. I forget the exact number. It's like $600 billion or something. Or, I'm sorry, $600 million. But anyway, so that's out of the bill. And to be clear, Congress can pass whatever it wants to. It's just about having the special rules
that allow
process.
You to avoid the filibuster.
That's right.
And there are a couple. There are tens of these provisions, at least, within the.
So this, CFPB is an example. There was another
artificial intelligence ban. There's a whole array of.
There's another one that got thrown out last night, which was the Republicans tried to repeal the CAFE standards for cars, which is an emissions standard, tailpipe emissions for cars, and say, cars have to have an average miles per gallon of 35 by X year. They tried to repeal that and say that would save money. And the parliamentarian said, no, you're trying to create policy, and that we're throwing.
Side note, the parliamentarian was sidestepped essentially when they essentially used the Congressional Review Act in a sort of a misappropriated way. But let's not confuse
this is a
things.
key point, right? Because this is the first time things have been kicked out of the bill. And John Thune is the Senate Majority Leader, has said we're going to abide by the parliamentarian. However, as you just said, they sidestepped the parliamentarian in one previous
3 weeks
case,
ago.
just a few weeks ago.
On
and
a
they
separate
also,
bill.
They also did it for this bill. When they were doing the budget resolution, and now we're going to get into real wonky
This is
stuff.
getting into very wonky stuff, but this is very important because we're talking about the baseline, right?
Right, yes.
Of how we approach the tax cuts that are set to expire.
Right.
And before we get to that, let's explain this other dynamic that exists with the Byrd rule, which is it needs to be deficit neutral 10 years out from the bill. Right.
Basically, it cannot create deficits after the 10-year budget window. Everything has to pencil out after that first 10 years. You can have it spend money or be a deficit in those first 10 years, but after that, it has to be neutral.
Which is why very often what we get is tax cuts that will expire in 10 years.
Which is what happened in the Trump tax cuts of 2017. The Trump tax cuts of 2017 actually expire at the end of this year.
Yep.
And that was to make it look cheaper and also to pencil out the budget neutrality outside the budget window.
And but when we talk about baseline,
right,
even though these tax cuts must expire,
right, so there's
by
a current
virtue of their very existence, they could not exist if they weren't to expire at the end of this year. However, there's some.
So the way it goes is there are two baselines you could use. There's a current law baseline and the current policy baseline. The current law baseline is, what does the law say? And the law says that these tax cuts expire in 2025. And therefore, if you extend them, it will cost the amount of the tax cuts in 2026 and 27 and 28 and 29 and so on. If you use the current policy baseline, the current policy is these tax cuts are in place. So if they just stay in place, that doesn't cost any money because it's just the same budget baseline as we have this year. And this is a really key point because of the rules of not just the rules of budget reconciliation, but also what it looks like to the public. Does it look like these things cost $3 trillion, or does it look like it's the difference between that and the bill looking like it saves money over the next 10 years, right? So the Senate is really, really interested in doing a current policy baseline.
The Republican Senate.
The Republican Senate. And the Democrats have said, well, that violates any standard because you could just pass a reconciliation bill saying Medicare for all, but we're only doing it for 1 year. And then the next year pass a reconciliation bill that says Medicare for all permanently, and that doesn't cost any money because it's current policy.
Right.
So is that really what you want to go for, Republicans? When Senate Republicans came up against this on the budget resolution, which kind of sets the terms for the reconciliation bill, they said, well, we don't need to ask the parliamentarian about that. And they just ignored the parliamentarian, didn't even ask her.
And they left it up to Lindsey Graham, who is the...
left it up to the budget chair, who is Lindsey Graham. And he said, yeah, sure, we'll do current policy baseline. Now we're in a position with the bill itself where Democrats are going to challenge that. And they're going to have the same debate in front of the parliamentarian this time. And I think some of these other things like CFPB or CAFE rules, Senate Republicans will probably not pick a fight over that. But if the parliamentarian says that the current policy baseline is out,
that's the biggest fight.
That's the biggest fight. And there may be a situation where they ignore the ruling of the chair, which they have the ability to do. And then
But Thune promised they wouldn't do it.
Thune promised, but we're going to see the rubber hit the road once
that's the big one. I mean, because like the AI regulations could drop out. We already have people in the House. We already have a couple people in the House who already say, I regret voting for the bill with that.
Big tech is lobbying furiously for that because it would ban all state regulations of artificial intelligence for the next 10 years. And that includes a whole host of products because AI is in
everything now, supposedly.
Not only that, but it's defined very broadly in the bill. So it could be, RealPage, uses an algorithm to make its recommendations on how landlords can jack up rents. Yep. That could be considered AI, and so states and cities cannot do regulations on RealPage. It has a huge set of implications.
And so those smaller things, they may drop out. We're gonna start seeing this, and this stuff is so Byzantine that, outside of like a couple of small podcasts, frankly, people are not aware of this. The big one being, though, that what is the baseline? What are we going to determine the cuts? And the argument that I saw Stephen Miller make, I think it was on Bannon. No, it was on with Kudlow, if you could believe it. Was there's no reason to expect that taxes are going to be any different tomorrow than they were today. Right. Which, of course, is like, what are you talking about? This entire bill, this tax regime was different than it was the day before you passed it.
If you extend this out, you just extend this logic out. There was a billboard on Fox News that said that this bill saved $8 trillion. And the way they got that is they said current policy baseline, that's $0. But also look at all the economic growth that this is going to spur if you extend the tax cut.
Well, that's the Laffer
which
curve.
Costs $0.
Right.
They said, oh, that's $3 trillion. That's going to so that saves the government or adds revenue of $3 trillion to the government. And then they said, but also look at all the money we're collecting from tariffs, which isn't in the bill at all. But they said that's another $3 trillion. And so they put this thing together, and it literally said that this bill saves $8 trillion.
I don't understand why they even bother to why not just put out a number and just, instead of like trying to have to reverse engineer where you're getting these figures for. I mean, they're literally just numbers floating in the air, and they just shove them in there, and they're meaningless. It feels like we don't have a media, broadly speaking, that has the ability to push back on these sort of completely fake narratives that exist. Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.